Okay, everyone, we have about 55 people online. I'm going to say 20, 25 people in the room, so everyone could sit. So that means we have, can't do the maths, we've got about 80 people, which is fantastic. So welcome, everyone. I'm Georgia Mason, Director of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the very last CCSAW Research Symposium of the academic year. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we're on an area covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between them and the Six Nations, sometimes known as the Iroquois Confederacy. And this was a treaty, an agreement, or an allyship that long predates European arrival. And today, these 7 nations are based on reserve land that's just south of Brantford. And I bring this up for a couple of reasons. One is it's the largest reserve in Canada, but still much less than they were promised, of course. It's also apparently very beautiful. It's half covered by what's known as Carolinian forest, which is ancient deciduous forest. And at least before the pandemic, tourism was a major source of income for the Six Nations. And today, they still have a very nice tourism website. And I bring this up because if you fancy kayaking or hiking somewhere pretty for the eclipse on April 8th, it looks like they're going to get a good 2 minutes of full eclipse. So the website is Six Nations Tourism, and I recommend it to you. All right, so without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce Sasha Protopopova. I nearly had it. Sasha Protopopova, great, who's an NSERC BC SPCA Industrial Chair in Companion Animal Welfare, and she's at the University of BC in their Animal Welfare Program. With a background in neuroscience and behavioral analysis at the University of Florida, where she did a PhD with Clive Wynne. Sasha is ideally placed to examine the links between welfare and cognition, or should I say dognition, because she really focuses on the canines that we live with. So dogs in our home, dogs in shelters, working dogs as well. So today she's going to give us our insights into aspects of control, predictability, and consent that may have important implications for welfare for dogs and other animals too. Sasha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Georgia. I'm coming from UBC, from the Animal Welfare Program, and I'm coming from the Musqueam First Nations land. And as an immigrant, I'm still very much learning how to think about these land acknowledgements and how to think about myself as a colonial person coming in and occupying the land. And so I really appreciate that education. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, but I'm afraid I think I don't actually have any answers to how do we think of choice and control and consent. But it is true that I am going to be talking mostly about dogs, primarily because I'm rather dog obsessed. I forget that other species exist, but I think hopefully all of these concepts do will make us think about species other than dogs, certainly. And one of those, we think about choice right now in terms of understanding animal welfare as kind of a central thing. And this is a wonderful quote that I stole from a recent publication by Georgia and her team, where Tadir kind of asked the question of how do we think about choice or agency, and how do animals think about choice? What is the importance of choice? And I think these kinds of questions are definitely very much up front and center at the moment when we're thinking about animal welfare, when we're thinking about how do we manage our animals in captivity, including companion animals, including kind of our own animals that we don't typically think of living in captivity, but certainly to some extent they are in our pet homes. But as one of the reasons for me, because I'm so dog obsessed, what I've been seeing is dog training professionals are also thinking about choice, thinking about consent, and how can we train dogs with that in mind, or with those kind of ideas in mind. And so one of those types of training programs is cooperative care, or cooperative training. Have you guys heard of this type of term? Yeah, it became popular through zoos, but dog trainers have taken this up. And luckily, we have in the audience Dr. Kara Van Hoften, who's a veterinary behaviorist and has engaged in husbandry training with her cat, Mickey. And so yesterday I took a video of them. And so here what's happening is that Mickey is invited to come up to the mat the mat is considered a consent behavior. So as Mickey comes up to the mat, Karen begins to brush. Mickey also gets those treats if he stays on the mat. Now, Mickey doesn't do this because he's a lovely cat, but what can happen also if Mickey leaves the mat, Karen will not follow. That is done. In this case, Mickey has told us that he no longer wants to engage in this activity, and that's the concept of cooperative care, that the animals are engaging in choice and having some control of this potentially aversive interaction, and they're letting us know what's going on. Which is very different from perhaps previous type of interaction, which would maybe we'll imagine grabbing a cat, putting a towel around, forcing the cat, and then start kind of brushing against their will. So that's kind of the opposite aspect of it. And cooperative care training can be really, really impressive. So this is a video I took from a different presentation, and you can see this is a very fancy type of training where for blood draw. And I really like that little tail wag that you see. Very excited little dog. And so this is a bit more similar to what one might see in zoos, where wild animals will present parts of their body against the fence for blood draws or for other kind of medical procedures. And so why are animal trainers interested in cooperative care? And I've put out these assumptions of kind of why is it good? And I think this is where it really does relate to our understanding of welfare, kind of what we think of why is this good for the animal? Why is it good for welfare? Well, first, there's some kind of terms that are thrown around, and I would like to spend some time thinking about what those terms mean, because fundamentally, with the terms.
Sorry, I just want to the notice at the top.
Oh, sure.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, fun.
So sorry to interrupt.
No,
I just
no worries.
want everyone to have to see that.
That's very annoying. Thank
There
you
we
so
go.
much for figuring that out. All right, I think should all be good. Thank you. So why is it good? So there are all these kind of terms that we definitely as lay people in our language have particular definitions or kind of our own mental definitions. But actually, if you kind of look at the literature, those terms don't really have very particular meanings. And a lot of authors will come up with their own definitions. And I've done the same. I've come up with my own definitions of how I understand these terms, or at least from what I see when I look at dog trainers engaging in cooperative medical care. So the first one is this concept of consent. We hear this a lot where the animal consents to this aversive procedure. And I'll think about it more from like a choice perspective and I'll explain why. Then this concept of that the animal, it's good that there is a choice present, right? So that choice of choice, that there is actually a preference for a choice condition versus a no choice condition. That's a different type of concept. Now, a final concept is that the animal can leave. So they can tell us when it's too much, perhaps some kind of control over the environment. So in this case, I've also kind of operationally defined it as a concept of the ability to escape. And so there's a couple of things here that I would like to spend some time on. And the first one comes from my background. I'm actually a psychologist, and I'm a psychologist in a very kind of particular subfield called behavior analysis. And behavior analysts, we think of science of behavior as a natural science. And so we tend to think about how can we remove mental states as causes, and instead kind of remove all of supernatural causes to behavior and look at environmental influences or genetic influences of behavior. And so in this sense, that fundamental aspect of choices then becomes a little bit problematic in that when we think of choice in our kind of human language, we definitely have one aspect of it's kind of an internal decision making, and we have made that choice mentally. But in fact, if it is the case that as a behavior analyst, I'm looking at this from scientific perspective, this is what we call a mentalistic approach. And perhaps it's a fallacy that the dog or an animal is an agent of their own behavior. Perhaps there's something that we can look at from the environmental perspective. And I imagine that you didn't think that I was going to start talking about free will, but I do have to tie into this. Like, do we in fact then have free will? Well, the science of behavior says actually we don't. And the only reason for that is not necessarily that everything is determined. There's no kind of predetermined map of our behavior. It's just that all behavior is explainable. It just means that it's not supernatural. It has causes that are natural and are observable and that we can calculate and we can predict. And predict not necessarily like I know what you're going to do and I can manipulate you, but in kind of in the same way how if I throw an apple, a physicist might be able to explain why that apple fell in that particular spot, but they won't be able to really predict exactly where it falls because of all of these causes, but nevertheless, all of those causes are still in the environment. They're still natural causes, and we can still kind of explain why that happened. And so this is what we mean by prediction and control. And in this sense, when you think about an animal walking around the environment, we're kind of imagining these force fields of previous learning history, that there's previous learning history of some attractants, there's some reinforcers in the environment that have some behaviors that have been previously reinforced. There's some punishers, there's some aversive stimuli that move the animal away from that choice. And so this concept of allocation of behavior is predictable and calculatable. So with that kind of background in mind, or at least the background of where I'm coming from as a behavior analyst, let's think about this concept of consent. So this is a video of what consent would look like in a dog training scenario. So here, the trainer is teaching a rest behavior, chin rest, as this first kind of initiation of consent. The idea is that when the animal engages in this consent behavior, that's going to be a signal for us to say we can get started. And then when they stop that kind of consent behavior, they remove the chin, then that means that we should stop doing it. But I want us to focus on that initial consent. So that initial understanding of when I put my chin down, I'm telling you that it's okay for you to do these medical things with me. And so if we really break down what consent is in this particular moment, I'm not really talking about informed consent from a kind of a medical perspective or a research perspective. This is really kind of our lay language consent. What we really mean is that they're choosing to engage in this particular husbandry task with us and not do other things in their environment. So what is choice, though? When we say about choosing, in fact, even the concept of choice or the term of choice is actually really not straightforward once we start thinking about things. One of the kind of more straightforward or simple ways to consider choice is really a way when an animal has an option to choose among several options or allocate behavior among several contingencies or several reinforcers that are guiding that behavior, essentially choosing among several alternatives. So something along these lines. So I'm going to present to you two options here. You can go one way and get a cake, or you can go another way and get nothing. Who's going to get the cake? Who's going to not get the cake? There's always one. But I can probably predict most of you guys are going to go choose the cake. But in this case, this is technically a choice, but perhaps this is not quite a choice that we would really think of a choice, right? This is really, most people don't really see this as a potential option. This is obvious that we're going to go choose that cake. Well, how about if we have a choice of something like this? Who's going to go for the cake? Who's going to go for the carrot? Oh, strange people going for carrots. But nevertheless, I imagine that there's some proportion or some distribution or allocation of behavior that's going to go to this lesser reinforcer for sure. This is now kind of starting to look a bit more like an option or choice. But perhaps this is maybe more of what we think about choice. So here, we would imagine that maybe there's an equal split across options. So this is a very hypothetical type of concept of choice. But in fact, if you think about it a little bit long enough, you start realizing that all behavior is in fact choice. That, of course, we don't usually have a situation where we only have two choices presented to us, but we do have situations where we think of doing this, but not doing anything else. So for example, right now, you have a choice of staying in your seat and not actually running around, laying down, all these other things that you could theoretically be doing. And so in the 70s, behavior analysts have come up with a whole bunch of different quantitative ways to try to measure and predict these particular types of choices of why animals not only go kind of choose amongst two options. This is, of course, done with pigeons and rats and operant chambers, but also thinking about choice as on one single option. So how can we think about kind of behaving as the choice itself? And so I'm not going to ask you to memorize any of these. And so this is the Herrnstein single choice hyperbolic equation that if one were to know the reinforcement on the target behavior, if one were to know all the other reinforcement that's ever possible in the environment for all other behaviors, that goes into this equation, there's some constant, you can predict what you're going to do. You're going to predict of why you would behave. McDowell updated this equation with things that I'm not going to bother you with, some sensitivity and bias, those are kind of genetic aspects of it. But nevertheless, what's important here is that there is a quantitative way to actually predict this kind of behavior, and it has been successful. And so this quantitative law of effect does also predict how much an animal will behave on this one alternative compared to changes on that particular alternative. So the more reinforcement you get on that alternative, the more you'll behave on that alternative. That's something that's very obvious for us. We're thinking about positive reinforcement, right? That's kind of how the whole point. But also it will say that how much you respond in this one alternative will also depend on all the other reinforcement you have in the world. So there are all other reinforcers that are available to every single thing else that you can do and not this one thing. And so in that sense, the allocation of behavior is in fact determined. And this is what we mean by, is there a free will? Because that previous learning history does guide us through our life and kind of why we're behaving in these particular ways and not those particular ways. So how does this matter to cooperative care or choice or animal welfare? So in that sense, if we think about cooperative care and thinking back about that pug doing a chin rest, yes, that is a consent if we want to think about it as consent, but really it is stacked up in our favor, right? Because we're reinforcing with food. And so the pug can do anything else, but there's not going to be food there, but there will be food in this particular location. And so if it was really a question of choice, perhaps this is something that we can ask the animal. Would you prefer to go get a shot, or would you prefer to not get a shot? I think all of us would probably say that there's no reasonable animal that's going to go choose the vaccine for fun. But this kind of paradigm could be interesting for other things. For example, perhaps it is a question of whether that vaccine is in fact aversive, right? That would be a question, because if an animal will choose equally, that might tell us that this is a neutral stimulus. There's actually nothing aversive about this. And I had a master's student, Megan Arendt, who did this study, who used a very similar philosophical paradigm to ask if therapy dogs liked children. So her question is, are children aversive? And we had therapy dogs in our study. This is in Texas Tech University, so not at UBC, where all of these dogs, the handlers were saying that children were the favorite population. The dogs love children. All of these are experienced therapy dogs. And so she set out a paradigm where there was a control condition where there's no children and an experimental condition with children. And each dog had a choice, would be placed in a room and had a choice of 2 buttons. One button was an escape condition, so the purple. If they pressed that button, they would get a treat, because dogs are always like treats. And then we would go out of the room, so they would get an escape. They would come back and then reset and make another choice. If they press the yellow button, they would still get that treat. So fixed ratio 1, still get a treat, but they stay in the room. So they don't go out. We compared with their response allocation without children. And then we put a child in and told the child, do whatever you want with the dog, essentially, and saw if the dogs actually altered their response. And so this graph shows us, so the white is the control condition, and the black bars are FR1 divided by the escape condition. So essentially on the y-axis, you're looking at the proportion of trials choosing to stay. And so you see how luckily for 3 dogs, they were great. They really wanted to stay. So they actually shifted their choice to stay in the room when the child was present. So in fact, we can say that maybe they even enjoyed the children. For one dog, Kingston, unfortunately, clearly absolutely did not enjoy. A child went immediately to the escape option and stayed there, and the rest didn't really care one way or another. And so it's great that out of all our dogs, the 3 did like the children, but you would hope that therapy dogs, whose favorite population are children, would actually all show this phenomenon. But unfortunately, that was not the case. So there's some curious kind of questions that we can do to ask animals various questions. But going back to cooperative care, are we actually interested in asking animals questions here? Are we asking them to make a choice, or are we really asking them to tolerate something that we need to do to them? So we need to have some medical things done to them, and we're just trying to make it better for them. So in that sense, we're really, in my opinion, are asking the animal to tolerate something aversive. And if you look at how animal trainers will actually do this, it looks more something like this. So this is actually kind of what a kind of a more reasonable choice would look like in medical training or cooperative care. where you have the aversive that's paired with a very high value reinforcer. And also, if you were to go out, there may be some kind of kibble for you available as well. And in that sense, of course, we do technically have a choice, but we can also probably imagine that the response, we know where the animals will go. Of course, unless the aversive gets really, really bad, then of course, then that high reinforcer is not going to be valuable and they will switch their options. But that just means that we'll just up the reinforcer value and then we'll get back our choice, or reduce the aversive quality of the aversive and then we'll have our choice again. But nevertheless, we know what we're going to get, essentially. And so it's not really a choice. And in fact, in human society, this is even ethically questionable. So these forced choices, that if you have a high value reinforcer plus an aversive, we don't necessarily think of these as good options for people. And in fact, they are ethically questionable. So another type of forced choices in our society that we have laws against, for example, in conducting human research, we can't pay too much. And that's because if we pay too much, that means we're forcing people into engaging in our research. Or donating organs for money, or carrying another's baby for a lot of money. So all of those that have those kind of inappropriate forced choice situations. So with that, but what about having a choice? Does it feel better than not having a choice? So even if, yeah, we know where what they're gonna choose because we've stacked in our favor, but does that still feel better? Are we kind of tricking the animal to think that they do in fact have some choice? And here, again, I think it's good to step back and thinking about operational definitions for our terms. What are actually we talking about? If we're talking about preference, that's one thing. That's perhaps how do animals prefer some stimuli over other stimuli? Do they prefer some behaviors over other behaviors? But allocation of behavior, that's something that we can control, whereas perhaps preference is something individual that, of course, maybe has some learning history behind it, but perhaps is also a genetic component as well. And that's somewhere we can ask questions. Whereas choice certainly has some aspects of preference, and we can ask about preference for choice. But just again, to clarify those terms, so that's easier to talk. But again, isn't having a choice better than not having one? And there has been very interesting findings in humans. So this is a big question in human psychology with children who are not verbal. So children who cannot quite tell us exactly what they want. And so here, researchers in behavior analysis have really spent a lot of time kind of trying to figure out if choice matters to children and how do we provide choice and what choice really kind of philosophically and in applied settings, what does it mean? And so there are some things that are kind of well established with children that children will work harder with an item that day out of an array. So if you present an array of items, so reinforcers, rewards for children, and they get to pick that item, they'll work harder for that item, or they'll work harder to access that item that day. And so that's one way to think about choice, but there are some problems, again, kind of from an empirical perspective. Is it really choice, or are we thinking about something else here? It was suggested perhaps that that chosen item was the most preferred that moment, that day. So for example, if an iPad is preferred one day, but you think that that's a preferred item, and then tomorrow you use the iPad, but perhaps the iPad is not actually preferred that day. So, so there are some aspects that we're really trying to get at kind of immediate preferences rather than this aspect of choice. And the item essentially was that best reinforcer in that moment. Same kind of thing about working harder. So if you offer children an option of, do you want to work on math or English? If they have that choice, they will kind of work better on that particular task. But again, it's still the same kind of problem, is that perhaps this is just a less aversive task that moment, or it was previously better reinforced. And so again, that doesn't really completely tell us what we want to know, is whether choice is better. And in fact, choice is really difficult to study, or the preference for choice is really difficult to study if you actually think about how you're going to do it in an animal. So one is kind of a very simple task is, okay, I'll give you one forced choice of an apple and another bowl of an apple and a banana. And here one could, of course, conceptualize that the banana and apple provide a choice option and an apple provide a no choice option. But of course, if we're just looking at these, they look very different. So one, there's a variety in one bowl, there's no variety in another bowl. So perhaps we're just looking at preference for variety. Perhaps we're looking at preference for quantity itself. So one has two items, one has one item. Perhaps there's some stimulus properties, like you really like red, or you really like yellow. Or maybe previously you've never eaten a banana in your life. You have no idea what banana is, but you know what an apple is. So you have a previous learning history of eating apples, but you don't have a previous learning history of eating bananas. So again, there's so many of these problems in experimentally trying to kind of understand and control for what is choice of choice, that it gets quite difficult. Now in primates, there has been over the years a lot of research on this particular question of, do primates or do monkeys choose to choose itself? Kind of trying to separate the concept of choice as an option, as a consequence itself that's worth going after. And because of all of these issues that I mentioned, that how do we kind of isolate the concept of choice, scientists are very clever and came up with this kind of select battery of different types of cognitive tasks. So this is a computerized program where monkeys are presented with a whole bunch of cognitive tasks. Those cognitive tasks typically are like a match to sample or a delayed match to sample, which would be like a sample stimulus comes up on the screen, and the monkey then chooses something that looks the same or different, or some quantity differences. So kind of relatively basic cognitive tasks that are presented to monkeys in laboratories. But the difference here with this battery is that the monkeys then can also select which one to work on. So they're not kind of presented with a cognitive task that the experimenter chose, but instead they're presented with a choice, and they choose that one, and they work away, and they choose the next one, they work away. And previous research, this is not the graph, has found that when monkeys select the task that they want to work on, they work better, they work faster. But again, it's the same kind of issues as the children issues. So perhaps those were less aversive at that moment. They were more fun tasks. How else do we isolate it? And so Purdue and colleagues in 2014 came up with a really clever way, I think, was that the difference here was isolating choice was that the monkeys were presented first with a question of choose your order of the tasks. So first you choose your order of the tasks. And then once you have this hierarchy of order on the preferred side, you yoke another choice to have the same order on the no choice side. And so then the order is actually the same, but in one order, the monkeys have chosen it, and the other one, it's the same order, but they have technically not chosen it. And so then it's kind of concurrent tasks that I'm not going to go over. It's a bit more complicated, but the fundamental thing is that over time, the monkeys did in fact shift their preference. So this is what you're looking at, set 3. That means that after a whole bunch of time, they did in fact prefer quite a bit. They chose the choice option, even though the actual outcomes were the same. And so I think this is a very kind of clever and interesting way, very complex, convoluted way to figure out if there is a preference for choice itself. And it seems like, at least for primates, there does seem to be a choice of choice. And there certainly is also previous research, older research on pigeons and rats that have also suggested that there may be this kind of preference for choice. But surprisingly, we don't have much other species research. And so this is something, if you're thinking of doing research, like I'm really excited about this area. Okay, so then other feature of cooperative care, going back to that. So there's the concept of the ability to say no, or ability to say stop. So this is kind of the same kind of thing about consent, but now withdrawing consent. Or in other ways of providing an escape contingency. And so what that would look like, these are stills, Chirag Patel's bucket game. The bucket game was what you saw Dr. Karen do with her cat. In this case, though, it was not, the escape response was not, or the stop behavior was not getting off the mat, but was removing gaze from the bucket. That's the stop behavior. And so here, Chirag would, while the dog would keep looking at the bucket, he would handle him. And as soon as the Chihuahua would look away, all the handling would stop. And that's kind of how that procedure works. And so in that question, of course, because we care about animal welfare, we care about the emotional state, we want to know if it feels better to have this concept of control, or this ability to stop this aversive interaction. And in human research, there is a lot of data here, which is quite lucky for us. So it seems like it does, in fact, feel better to some extent to have that control. And so the research that is typically done with humans is to create some kind of aversive scenario. And the aversive scenario typically is to put your hand in ice water. So that's why I have that child there. So that's a typical human stressor type of experiment. Psychologists are a little bit mean. And so here, there are some kinds of experiments or experimental paradigms that can be done to look at the effect of control itself. And so the paradigm is typically you're in the waiting room and you're told that I'm going to do this to you. I'm going to put your hand in ice water and you cannot take it out. That's the uncontrollable condition. Whereas another set of people are told that you're going to put that hand in ice water, but don't worry, if it's too much, you can take it out. Of course, all humans are not forced. Everyone can take out their hand, but that's what they're told. And then the question is, how do they feel? And so, in fact, there was reduced stress during the anticipatory period, which is kind of logical for us humans if you imagine yourself in the same scenario. But curiously, there was an increased tolerance of the aversive. So people who were told that they could take out their hand, they spent longer time in the ice bath compared to people who were told that they cannot take that hand out. They were also asked, I believe, math questions at the same time as having their hand in the water, in the ice. And so for those people who were told that they have control, they were more able to work during that presentation of the aversive. And also their cortisol recovery was faster after the aversive event. And so it seems like for humans, at least, this does seem like a good thing in all kinds of aspects. Oh, interestingly, when asked how bad the aversive was, how cold was the water, both groups said the same thing. So everyone perceived the aversiveness as equal. That's, I think, quite interesting. So there's other aspects of it that were important. We also have quite a bit of research on non-human animals here. This is an older study in laboratory dogs, where if you just look at the gray versus white block, so controllable versus uncontrollable, you see differences in cortisol stress hormone levels. Where dogs were placed in a cage and they were shocked. They can either escape shock or they cannot escape shock. And this is the kind of anticipatory period. And in fact, dogs who could not escape also perceived, like humans, that this was more stressful than not. Okay. Now, moving on, we might wonder, as I have, well, if we're thinking about cooperative care, it takes a long time to train. There's a whole bunch of effort involved in this. Maybe we can just forget and just do it quickly. And that's the kind of method that in veterinary schools is kind of, I think, a pretty prevalent one. Just do it quickly, get it over and done with, and they'll be done. And so when we think about this, what we really are asking is that, is there a preference for kind of the unknown? Or is there a preference, kind of how do animals want to receive aversive things done to them? Do they want to not know, or do they want to know whether aversive things will happen to them? And so here, there's some paradigms that are available in experimental psychology that can help us out. So animals do prefer fixed time shock versus variable time shock. So it means that if you shock an animal continuously on one option, and the other option they can choose, and they get shocked randomly, they will choose the constant shock, or the fixed time shock, so they can predict it. So that's one type of evidence. Another one is that the animals prefer signaled versus unsignaled shock. So again, if you have an option, you choose one option, and I'm going to tell you when the shock comes, so tone, then shock, versus another option, I'm just going to shock without the tone. They will prefer the tone to shock. And so this is where they prefer signaled. And so in general, in that case, we can probably conclude that animals do want to know when bad things are happening rather than be surprised. I have an asterisk there because it actually depends on the method, but let's just not worry about it for the sake of making it easier. There's some other things actually like that. Yeah, let's not get into it. It's a little bit. And we can kind of imagine that that's something for us. Like if we are imagining you go on one side and I occasionally throw cold water on you, however, you go on this side, you for sure get cold water on you. Yeah, probably most of us will go to I for sure know I'm going to get cold water rather than be surprised. Although I don't know, maybe some people will wonder, especially because the probability of aversives is lower on the surprising one. So maybe not. So that's not a good controlled study. But there is evidence here that unexpected aversive stimuli do result in higher stress hormones of animals. These are rats. The stressor here was a novel arena. The control is no stressor. Novel 1, that's the stressor the same time each day, so fixed time. Novel 2, that's a stressor random times each day, so that's a variable time variable. And you can see how there is a difference there, that animals are more stressed during unexpected stressors. And the same study that we saw with dogs, again, signaled or predictable is results in lower levels of cortisol than unsignaled. And this is something that was very interesting from an applied perspective. We conducted a study with Karen and it was my PhD student, Bailey Egan's study on the use of gabapentin for cats in hoarding situations. This is not really the purpose of the study at all, but something that I learned was very interesting and that kind of connected to that kind of signaled versus unsignaled, where animals want to know when bad things are coming, is that the BCSPCA has a really clever program that when you come into a cat room, you knock on the door first to announce yourself to the cats that you're coming in, you open the door, and then you say the reason for your visit. And of course, it was standardized. So food time or pookie means vaccines are coming or bad things are happening to them. And so again, to kind of make sure that there's the conditioned stimuli are there, or the signals are there for the animals. This is a photo of our research assistant conducting research with gabapentin in the hoarded cats. And Maki is actually a first-year vet student at OVC, so it's kind of cool. Well, everything is connected. But even though I thought this was so lovely, it's not that straightforward either. The anticipation of a stressor can actually be worse than a stressor itself, to make things even more complicated. So if we think of the human research, where they were asked, they were going to be waiting in the waiting room, they were told they were going to be placing their hand in cold water, and then going to the cold water. If you looked at their stress levels, physiological stress levels, they were higher in the anticipation period than the actual period of the stressor. And so is it then the case that even though there is a preference for that, perhaps from a welfare perspective, this is actually going to stress animals more than not? And so unfortunately, not very clear. And so going back to it, is it better to distract? And here there is again, some on the human side, there are some ideas that, well, perhaps not all humans are the same. Perhaps there are personality differences where maybe you have vigilant humans and you have non-vigilant humans, and vigilant humans will prefer kind of more, they will get more stress during unexpected aversive events, and distraction results in more stress. In that case, that having the control and having that ability to escape, having that knowledge is really important. I'm thinking of herding dogs for some reason a lot. Like a Australian Shepherd or Border Collie, I feel like they have to have that information. That's kind of the animal I'm imagining, even there's no research. This is just me imagining, like anthropomorphism based on the human stuff. And perhaps there's some non-vigilant, more like pity bulldog animals that perhaps distraction is enough, that there is less stress, and that anticipation is worse than the stressor. And maybe distraction strategies will be more effective. I have this really cute video that I think we do have time to show, so why don't we see it?
Grab my fingers. I'll take the thumb.
Are you kidding me? Wow.
So then there's another component that's not necessarily part of cooperative care, but I think part of our concepts of another word that I have actually not touched upon, agency or empowerment overcoming, challenge, all these other terms that we have that feel important or that feel like it reflects the human experience of choice or of agency or of something like that. And so that I do have harder time kind of wrapping my head around. And I think this is where there's lots of thinkers kind of on these topics. And so the fundamental kind of idea here for the children does kind of ask the question of if children learn to succeed in certain tasks, is that better? Is it good to have children kind of come up with a challenge and overcome that challenge? Does that make them kind of grow as individuals? And I think we feel like, yes, we feel like that is something that's important. But what does it actually mean if we break it down to environmental contingencies and really kind of like, what are we actually saying? And in this case, isn't this an effect of very mild negative reinforcement? And so that we put in some aversive, hopefully mild aversive, because you can escape it and not kind of get stuck and be so scared of this thing. And then have the animal find an escape response. And in that sense, that relief perhaps is what's important, that having that relief is very nice. And maybe even there's some Pavlovian conditioning for those of us who want to even think further in how all of this is connected. And in that sense, if we're talking about an aspect of negative reinforcement and escape from negative reinforcement contingency, perhaps we also have to make sure that, is it something different than escape itself? Is it something different than pure control? And so again, kind of highlighting how important it is to really agree on the terms and really kind of first identify, even for us humans, what we're talking about, to then try to apply it for animals. But just because we have time, and I haven't actually talked about any of my own research, I decided I'm just going to have a couple of slides where it kind of connects to this about relief. And it wasn't the research that I'm going to talk about. It wasn't actually meant to set out a question about relief, but it accidentally did. And so we were trying to figure out a way to study mood or even think about mood or good mood or again, because we're dog people, we're thinking about trigger stacking. Is there evidence for trigger stacking? For those of you guys who are trainers, this is kind of a concept of phenomenon of there's a little stressor, the dog's fine. There's another stressor, the dog is like, no, it's okay. There's a third stressor, and now there's a problem. Now there's a reactivity and barking. And so the concept of that small triggers kind of add up together to create this kind of outburst, even though the last trigger might be very small and might itself not actually create any triggers. But because we don't really want to stress dogs in the laboratory, we kind of try to switch this around and kind of induce a good mood to protect the animal from stressors. So kind of, can we build resiliency? So kind of the opposite. And so what we try to do is have two groups of dogs. One group of dogs had a pleasant experience before our stressor. Another group of dogs had a very boring experience before our stressor. So the kind of good experienced dogs, they got to go on a very long line, so essentially off leash for 15 minutes with their owner, with the experimenter. They got to hang out with the experimenter, get to know them. There was food sprinkled all over the leaves. This is the Vancouver campus. So they got to search through, which is something that previous research has suggested that dogs really enjoy, this kind of nose work, searching. They got toys, kind of like, please, dog, tell us anything. Everything is here. And no commands, no nothing, no demands, nothing on the dog. The other group of dogs, the bored dogs, they were led in the waiting room on a leash. The owner was told to ignore them for 15 minutes. We didn't touch the dog, and the dog was not very happy, technically very bored. This is kind of what happened. They would get a little frustrated, and then they would just lay down. So not anecdotally, not a particularly happy moment for the dogs. And then they were placed into our laboratory, which is just an empty room. And there they were trained up on a simple task that doesn't really mean much, is just nose touch to the hand. So they would be learning that when you touch the nose to my hand, you get food. So they were just doing this nose touch experiment or procedure. And then a remote control car came on. So here, very difficult to see. This is our experimental stressor that we use in our lab. This is a see-through tub with a remote control car, and the car just kind of starts going in circles without kind of touching the walls, so it's not very scary. And the owner is always in the room, of course. And so typically the dogs don't get too nervous around these things. They get kind of very confused initially, and they startle, of course, and then they observe like what's going on. They sniff them. And so we try to find a stressor that's not going to be horrific and traumatic to the dog. So it's relatively mild stressor. But the idea was, can we is it the case that the dogs who had this pleasant experience, they're kind of inoculated against the stress, so they're more resilient, they can come back away from it, versus the dogs who were bored, who did not get the happy experience, they would get more stressed, kind of that concept of trigger stacking or not getting this protective feeling. And in fact, we had the exact opposite data, which I would hope that you guys can tell me what's going on. The happy experience made it worse. So they did have the same time until acquisition itself, but the dogs in the happy group had higher proportion of stress signals. They had higher proportion of time and proximity to the owners, so they were seeking reassurance from the owner. They had tendency to be slower to return to the task to work, less touches during the stress phase, so they weren't working as much away to get food. And so they were just not doing as well as the dogs who were bored, who were stressed. And so certainly there are plenty of explanations here, everything from probably the more likely one I think we settled on is that there was additional habituation in place in the waiting room that was more similar to the indoor area versus an outdoor area. I think that's probably the most likely explanation, but there's also a romantic one about relief itself, that perhaps there is something that after a stressor, you're kind of more resilient as well. Which is perhaps has some components of empowerment maybe in it, but it's ambiguous enough where maybe it is something to study in the future. Whereas, of course, our experiment certainly didn't answer any of those questions, but just had some suggestions of those. Okay, and with that, I think like I said, I don't have any answers, but I do hope that we can take time to kind of ponder some questions and really think about the terms and really think about what we actually mean by consent. Is it just choice? Is it responding in one option? Are we asking for choice, or are we asking to tolerate something? When are we talking about preference versus actual choice? Or what do we mean by choosing choice and so on? And it does seem that choice is preferred, at least for primates and rats and pigeons. So we would imagine that it's for many other animals, but perhaps this is an area of further inquiry that we could go after. But really, more importantly, what is it? Just because there is a preference, it doesn't necessarily mean it's better for welfare either. Perhaps preference and welfare maybe are related, but again, those connections do need to be explicitly made. And when we talk about control, again, what are we actually talking about? Is this opportunity to escape? And how does empowerment and agency and other kinds of terms that we throw around really fit into all of these, all these things? And so with that, just a quick poster advertisement for next lecture. And thank you guys so much. And I hope we can have some fun discussions on especially how to design studies and actually asking these kind of questions. Thank you.